Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to take a really dense stack of material. In this case, it's a comprehensive white paper on a massive societal shift, and really just pull out the most important insights for you.
Right. We're connecting the dots between something that feels very personal, intergenerational influence, and these huge society-wide breakdowns.
And we're trying to give you that necessary shortcut to being, well, extremely well informed on a topic that really it affects every single family in the Western world.
And today's deep dive is, I have to say, particularly provocative. We're looking at a paper that's focused on the collapse of elder women's wisdom transmission. And it puts forward a remarkably bold hypothesis. It tries to pinpoint the single largest cause of the profound societal decline we've seen since the 1960s.
I have to pause here because the hypothesis the authors lay out is genuinely shocking. It's almost counterintuitive, that is, until you start to see the statistical support they bring.
It's a big claim.
It's a huge claim. They're saying that the ideological capture of elder women, specifically grandmothers, since 1960, accounts for, get this, approximately 35 to 50% of the variance.
50%.
50%. Across everything. Fertility collapse, divorce rates, the mental health epidemics we see in younger generations.
It is a radical claim. It basically positions the grandmother's function as let's call it the primary mechanism for cultural continuity. So if that mechanism breaks,
the whole civilization breaks.
The civilization breaks. And the paper uses, a multifaceted methodology to back this up. It's got deep historical analysis, anthropological work, robust statistical correlations.
And they do these counterfactual comparisons, right? Looking at communities that haven't collapsed.
Exactly. And even a pretty detailed theological framework to try and interpret the outcomes.
So our task is critical. We're connecting what seems like a simple family matter, what a grandmother teaches her granddaughter, to these massive societal metrics. If this paper is even, say, half correct, we're talking about the foundational infrastructure of culture just utterly failing.
And before we can even analyze the failure, we have to understand what the functional before picture looked like.
Right. What exactly was lost?
That's the essential starting point. We have to establish the traditional role of the grandmother, as this research defines it, and really highlight its deep anthropological and even theological necessity long before the Cultural Revolution kicked off.
Okay, so the paper starts by saying that historically the grandmother wasn't just this, pleasant, optional relative.
Not at all. She was a crucial evolutionary necessity. I mean, literally for the survival of this species.
And this is where they bring in the grandmother hypothesis. It sounds like a piece of academic jargon, but it's foundational to what makes humans unique, isn't it?
Absolutely. There was pioneering research by anthropologists like Kristen Hawkes back in 1998. They noticed something unique about human females.
Their long lifespan after they can no longer have children.
Exactly. An extensive post-reproductive lifespan, which is distinct from almost all other mammals. And this longevity wasn't some, accident. It was actively selected for. And the reason is that grandmother care directly increased the survival and success of her offspring's children.
So all that energy the elder woman would have spent trying to have her own kids after menopause gets reallocated.
Right. It gets reallocated into caring for and provisioning her grandchildren. And that energy shift provides a massive competitive advantage for the whole lineage.
That makes perfect sense.
It does. I mean, if the maternal grandmother is there providing reliable, consistent care, digging for tubers, passing on medical knowledge, whatever it is, the mother can wean her existing children earlier.
Which means she can conceive again more quickly.
And shorten the birth interval. It significantly boosts the total reproductive success of that family line. It's literally hardwired into our species.
And the source says this isn't just one or two cultures.
No, it's overwhelming. The research shows these universal patterns across pretty much every human society they studied. Traditional Chinese households, various African tribes, Native American communities.
All of them.
In all of them, grandmothers were universally critical for basic knowledge transmission. They were teaching the essential skills the mother just didn't have time for. Things like foraging, basic medicine, food prep like canning or preservation, and, critically, cultural continuity. The stories, the traditions.
And this isn't just, a nice story or some conjecture. There's quantitative data behind this.
That's right. The paper cites a really significant meta-analysis by Sear and Mace from 2008. They reviewed data from 45 different human populations all over the globe.
What did they find?
They found that the presence of the maternal grandmother was the single most strongly correlated factor with child survival rates. So this isn't just culture. This is a deep biological imperative. Grandmothers keep babies alive, and therefore grandmothers were required for society to function.
So you have the biological necessity, and then the source pivots to the theological framework, the moral and structural mandate for that wisdom, specifically from the Christian tradition.
And that instruction chain is absolutely crucial to the paper's whole argument. The core scriptural foundation they cite is the Apostle Paul's instruction in Titus 2.
Titus 2, verses 3 through 5.
Yes. And this text specifically defines the elder women's divinely mandated teaching role. They are instructed to teach what is good, and so train the young women to love their husbands and children, to be sensible, chaste, domestic.
It is extraordinarily specific. It's not a suggestion. It's a curriculum, really. Love, chastity, domesticity, the things the elder generation is required to transmit.
And the paper tracks this historically, this continuity across centuries and denominations, from historical Catholic teachings, St. Augustine, the Council of Trent, emphasizing the mother and grandmother's role as the domestic church, all the way to the American pattern, from 1620 up until 1960.
So across all these different groups, grandmothers were the keepers of tradition.
Ugh.
The moral authorities, providing skills like midwifery, textiles, food preservation.
Unquestionably. And the source makes a very specific claim, that the 1950s, the generation of the silent generation grandmothers, was the last generation of widely functional traditional grandmothers.
That puts a very fine point on the timeline of the breakdown.
It does. So let's drill down into the three critical functions the source says were integral to this wisdom, the things that were lost and are now directly impacting our society. The first, and the one they see as the strongest link, is moral and spiritual formation. The practices were active and concrete, teaching daily prayers like the Rosary, reading Bible stories, lives of saints, enforcing mass attendance, and forming children in virtues like modesty, chastity, obedience.
This is where that Bengtson study comes into play, and frankly, the data point here is one of the most staggering things in the entire paper.
It is the smoking gun for transmission power. It was a long-term study by Bengtson and his colleagues. It spanned over 4 decades. And it found that grandparent religiosity is the strongest single predictor of grandchild religiosity.
And that holds true even when you control for what the parents believe.
Even when you control for the parents' current level of faith, or even their lack of faith.
Okay, I have to stop you there. That's incredible. The Bengtson data implies that the school system, or even what the mother does day to day, is less powerful than the grandmother's moral and spiritual authority. Why? Why is her faith transmission so uniquely powerful?
Well, the paper suggests it's 2 things. First, the grandmother represents a kind of immutable, fixed point of tradition. She's the living history of the faith. But second, and maybe this is more important, she often introduces the grandchild to the transcendent before the parent has had a chance to, dilute it or reject it. The study's numbers were stark. When a grandmother was highly religious, a significant 63% of her grandchildren remained religious. But on the flip side, when the grandmother was non-religious, only 7% became religious.
So that positions the grandmother as the key spiritual gatekeeper for the entire lineage. If she fails, the lineage's faith is, statistically speaking, doomed inside of 2 generations.
It's a huge responsibility. And moving beyond the spiritual, the second lost function is practical wisdom transmission. This is the passing down of essential domestic arts.
Cooking from scratch, canning, sewing, budgeting.
All of it. Overall home management. And the source draws a direct line between the loss of these skills and the cultural shifts of the 60s, the rise of consumer culture.
Right. They cite that data point about daily cooking time.
Precisely. It plummeted from 113 minutes in 1965 down to just 37 minutes by 2015. As food became processed, as consumer goods became readily available, the grandmother's knowledge base was it was functionally sidelined.
If you don't need your grandmother to can vegetables or mend your clothes, her daily presence in the household diminishes.
And with it, her authority.
It makes you wonder, if these foundational necessary skills are just gone, how does the next generation even learn them? They can't.
And finally, the third function, and this is the one that maybe impacts marriage and societal stability the most profoundly.
Relationship and mate selection wisdom.
Yes. The grandmother acting as the calibration mechanism for courtship.
These were the explicit instructions on how to vet a partner, and they were designed not just for, personal happiness, but for the long-term stability of the whole family unit.
Exactly. The guidance was specific and protective. Watch how he treats his mother. Is he a man of faith and character? And the very practical, don't marry potential, marry reality. This was wisdom rooted in decades of just watching human nature and selecting against risk.
And it didn't stop at the wedding day. The guidance extended into marriage maintenance.
Yes, they modeled perseverance. They were the ones who would step in during a hard time and say, look, your grandfather and I had hard times too. You work through this. They enforced the idea of permanence, teaching you never threaten divorce, especially once kids are involved.
And the paper notes this was effective. It was a documented protective factor against divorce.
A massive one. A factor that just, poof, vanished in the generations that followed.
Okay, so we've established this robust, complex, and evolutionarily necessary role that the grandmother played. Now we have to get to the inflection point, the shift from those traditional silent generation grandmothers to the ideologically captured baby boomer grandmothers.
And the 1950s, you have to remember, that was a statistical high watermark for so many of these metrics. A 3.7 total fertility rate in 57, over 90% marriage rate. Divorce was below 3 for 1,000 people. The source argues this breakdown wasn't random. It was triggered by very specific, rapid cultural and legal changes that just broke the grandmother's chain of influence.
And the source identifies a few major catalysts in the 60s and 70s that just dismantled the whole moral structure she was meant to uphold.
The first, and the paper argues it's the most important, was the 1960 approval of the pill.
They call it the most important fact about the 1960s.
And the mechanism is pretty clear, right? It enabled the separation of sex from procreation with high reliability for the first time in human history.
It just fundamentally destroyed the moral constraints that had governed courtship for millennia.
It did. The biological necessity for responsibility, for commitment, was chemically erased. And once sex was detached from its primary function, procreation, well, the need for the grandmother's wisdom on moral boundaries and family stability just rapidly eroded.
Then came the second catalyst, the intellectual one. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963. This was the ideological capture of the next generation of grandmothers.
It was a really successful reframing of reality. Friedan basically pathologized contentment in the domestic sphere. She defined the normal stresses and sacrifices of motherhood as a problem that has no name.
A kind of mental illness.
Exactly. And the solution she proposed was career independence, a rejection of the traditional role. And that message profoundly captured the young baby boomer women who were just, entering university. And they would eventually become the grandmothers of millennials.
And then the legal system codified this new reality.
The legal breaking points followed right after. No-fault divorce laws starting in 69, and then Roe v. Wade in 73. No-fault divorce just turned marriage from a lifelong covenant, which the grandmothers enforced, into this easily dissolvable contract.
And divorce rates shot up.
Doubled by 1980. And then Roe v. Wade completed the separation by normalizing the destruction of the child.
The paper makes a powerful argument that by 1980, the institutions that shaped the minds of these boomer women, education, psychology, the media, were just thoroughly captured.
They were. They were taught to reject the wisdom of their own mothers, the silent generation. And this brings us to the crucial point. The ideological poisoning was done, but the collapse only truly accelerated when these boomer women became grandmothers themselves.
Right. The period from 1990 to 2010, that's what the source identifies as the critical transition.
This is the moment when the ideologically captured boomers, the 70 to 80% who affirmed this new feminist paradigm, started transmitting inverted values to the millennials and Gen Z.
So what did that boomer grandmother profile look like?
Well, it was drastically different from her mother's. High rates of divorce. The source estimates 70% have experienced divorce or subsequent marriages. Career-focused, so 60% are still working, which means less time, less proximity, and adopting this permissive, cool grandma identity.
And the ideological gap is huge.
It's stark. Boomer grandmothers showed 58% approval of premarital sex versus only 15% for the silent generation. 70% supported no-fault divorce compared to just 35% of their mother's generation.
So the role was fundamentally inverted. Instead of being the preserver of tradition and the guardian of stability, she became the accelerator of collapse. She was transmitting the cultural poison she'd ingested in the 60s and 70s right down the line.
And the outcome map matches this timeline perfectly. The shift in grandmother ideology in the 90s precedes this explosion of grandchild dysfunction in the 2000s and 2010s.
The highest rates of anxiety, mental illness, lowest marriage rates.
The explosion of the religiously unaffiliated, the knowns among millennials and Gen Z, it all lines up.
And this cultural degradation, it's compounding, isn't it? The paper says Gen X grandmothers are often even more captured.
They are. They were raised without a functional grandmother themselves, so they have even less traditional wisdom to pass on, which just accelerates the cultural velocity towards collapse.
Which leads to the current catastrophic outcomes we see in Gen Z. The paper points to that recent CDC data.
Yeah, it's frightening. 57% of teen girls reporting persistent sadness and 30% seriously considering suicide. These are the children born at the precise moment that intergenerational chain of wisdom had become functionally defunct.
The source even provides a mathematical model for this, right? It's a formula for this generational degradation.
It's pretty chilling. They use the formula Tn plus 1 equals Tn, A1In. T is the level of traditional wisdom, and I is the corruption rate.
And it illustrates how fast this cultural extinction happens.
It does. If the grandmother generation has a severe corruption rate, let's say I is 0.7, so 70% of the transmission's corrupted, the math shows that the original traditional wisdom becomes functionally extinct, down to like 0.007 of the original level in only 4 or 5 generations.
So 1960 to 2020, that timeline perfectly aligns with that 4 to 5 generation wipeout. The destruction isn't slow and gradual. It's a rapid, compounding catastrophe once that primary cultural memory mechanism is compromised.
Okay, now we get into the core evidence, the paper's quantitative analysis. And they're trying to move beyond just correlation here to argue for causation.
Right. And the gold standard for this in, say, epidemiology is the Bradford Hill criteria.
We should probably pause and explain what that is.
Sure. The Bradford Hill criteria are just a set of standards used to establish strong evidence for a causal relationship, especially when you can't do a controlled experiment, and asks things like, is the association strong? Did the cause come before the effect? Does the pattern repeat consistently? And is there a plausible mechanism?
And the paper claims that the link between grandmother ideology and societal collapse satisfies all these demands. So let's start with domain 1, family formation and stability.
Okay, we see these clear metrics of a retreat from commitment. The number of never married women aged 40 to 44 jumps from just 6% in 1960 up to 17% in 2020. And at the same time, the median age of marriage for women is delayed.
From 20.3 to 28.1. And the source claims this delay isn't just, a cultural preference. It's a direct consequence of the grandmother's advice.
The career first and travel first ideology.
Exactly. And that delay is catastrophic for fertility. But the most explosive metric here is the single motherhood epidemic. We went from 5.3% of births to unmarried women in 1960 to 40.5% in 2020.
A massive jump. And this is where the paper makes its strongest, most controversial claim about the grandmother's culpability in father absence. How does she specifically cause this?
The source claims that the modern grandmother ideology accounts for a massive 49 to 54% of father absence, and it works through a 3-pronged enabling pathway. This is the crucial mechanism we have to understand.
Okay.
The first pathway is simply encouraging and enabling single motherhood. In the old model, the grandmother enforced high standards of marriage or adoption. The modern, ideologically captured grandmother provides the cultural permission structure. She offers free childcare, financial help, emotional validation. She tells her daughter, "You don't need him. I'll help you raise this child." This removes the primary stabilizing pressure, the economic and social necessity of the father.
She effectively becomes the replacement for the absent father, but without that masculine stabilizing presence.
Precisely. The second pathway is encouraging or supporting divorce. The traditional grandmother modeled perseverance. The modern one models therapeutic self-interest. So when a daughter complains about her marriage, the modern grandmother acts as this permissive counselor,
saying things like, you deserve to be happy.
Your feelings are valid, actively encouraging the dissolution of the marriage, and by doing so, creating father absence in her own grandchildren's lives.
And the third pathway,
encouraging promiscuity that leads to pregnancy with unreliable men. By removing the old moral boundaries, approving of premarital sex, casual relationships, the grandmother's ideology indirectly pushes her daughter into risky situations, increasing the odds of a pregnancy with a man who was never vetted for paternal commitment.
I see the connection now. The traditional grandmother was the stabilizing force demanding responsibility. The modern one is the enabling force validating irresponsibility. And the outcome for the child is catastrophic father absence.
And this leads right into domain 2, female mate selection dysfunction, which the paper argues is maybe the most critical long-term driver of societal imbalance.
This goes back to that lost calibration mechanism. Historically, elder women taught young women how to distinguish good male traits from destructive ones.
Right. Confidence versus narcissism. Dominance versus abuse. And the paper links the modern breakdown to feminist ideology that rejected the male provider role, valorized female independence, and just encouraged exploration. And this led to completely uncalibrated mate selection.
And the data from online dating really shows the consequences of this.
It does. You're talking about the Bruch-Newman study from 2018. It quantified what a lot of people suspected.
What did it show?
It showed that women, on average, message men who are 25% more desirable than themselves. They're systematically ignoring their peers. And critically, women rate 80% of men as below average.
Which is mathematically impossible.
It creates impossible selection standards. And it results in that winner-take-all mating pattern, unchecked hypergamy, where the top 20% of men get 80% of female attention, regardless of their long-term commitment traits.
And the source is adamant. The grandmother's failure to calibrate this, or actively miscalibrating it with advice like don't settle and have fun, is the single highest factor. They say it's responsible for 60% of this dysfunction.
They failed to teach prudence. And the long-term impact of this is just devastating across generations.
Yeah.
If women are systematically selecting against provider traits and paternal investment,
Then men start to withdraw from the system.
that's the consequence. Uncalibrated selection over 3 or 4 generations selects against responsible, dedicated men and selects for men with player traits. And the paper connects this directly to that decline in prime age male labor force participation, that 8.7 percentage point drop since 1960. When women signal they don't need a stable provider, many men just stop trying to be one.
So finally, let's revisit Domain 3, moral and spiritual collapse. We charted the rise of the knowns, the religiously unaffiliated, from 5% in 1970 to 29% in 2020, millennials at 40%.
And we have to reinforce the Bengtson study's finding here, because grandmother religiosity is the strongest single predictor. The ideological shift in the boomer generation led to a massive, what they estimate is a 50% failure rate in faith transmission to millennials and Gen Z.
But the collapse isn't just about church attendance numbers, is it? It's about the psychological and moral structure.
Exactly. Traditional grandmothers transmitted deep psychological resilience. It was rooted in an eternal perspective. They taught kids to cope by saying, offer it up, or this too shall pass. Modern grandmothers, who were so influenced by therapeutic culture, they transmitted messages of entitlement. You deserve to be happy. Your feelings are always valid. And often, you need therapy. You need medication to cope.
That shift from resilience based on sacrifice to fragility based on self-entitlement leads directly to the generation documented by researchers like Jean Twenge.
A generation with high narcissism, anxiety, and a severe decline in self-control. A generation unable to cope with the normal, difficult stresses of life.
Now we have to turn to the most ethically and socially charged domains in the source material, where the grandmother's pivotal role becomes, frankly, horrifyingly clear, starting with the scale of the abortion factor.
The moral landscape just completely shifted after 1973. Before that, the grandmother's moral authority enforced stability. It was either a shotgun wedding or adoption. The child lived and had a family structure. Post-1973, that authority was replaced by cultural acceptance for abortion.
And the paper's data on generational influence here it's just stunning.
It is. The source estimates that combined mother plus grandmother influence, meaning the grandmother was either directly involved, supportive, or emotionally pushing, was present in 53% of post-abortive women that were surveyed.
So that makes the grandmother not just a passive observer, but an active participant in that choice.
An active participant. And the nature of that influence was multi-layered. It was emotional pressure, ideological conviction, and financial enablement.
What does that look like in practice?
The grandmother would often provide the money for the procedure, use emotional leverage like, you're too young, think of your career, or justify it ideologically with women's rights language. The key mechanism is that this grandmother's affirmation provides the moral permission structure, allowing the daughter to go ahead without facing the moral weight or family disapproval that once prevented it.
Now, we need to be very clear and report the author's calculation on the scale of this, framing it as the claim of the source paper.
Yes. The authors of the white paper calculate the scale based on this failure of transmission. They estimate that if traditional grandmothers had maintained their moral authority and enforced those traditional standards, 40 to 60% of abortions would have been prevented.
Which translates to a horrifying figure.
It does. 25 to 38 million lives saved since Roe v. Wade.
And the calculation of total culpability is staggering.
The paper asserts that total grandmother culpability, combining both direct support and creating the permissive conditions, is as high as 85% of all U.S. abortions.
Wow.
The logic is that without that cultural and familial support structure created by the captured grandmother generation, the majority of women would have faced enough moral pressure to choose life, adoption, or marriage.
Okay, let's move to the second deeply troubling domain, the gender confusion epidemic. Specifically, that phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROGD, that just spiked dramatically after 2010 among adolescent girls.
Right, and this phenomenon is distinct from historical forms of gender dysphoria. It's characterized by its rapid onset, it often appears in friend clusters, and it's highly correlated with social media use. And the source identifies the grandmother as a key accelerator of this social contagion.
The paper identifies three types of grandmothers here, but it's the affirming grandmother that is the focus of the mechanism of harm.
That's right. The traditional grandmother would be a protective factor. The permissive one might just ignore it. But the affirming grandmother is the harmful intervention. This is often the ideologically captured boomer or Gen X grandmother who sees transition as an act of liberation or a fight for rights.
And why is her intervention so damaging?
Because case studies repeatedly show the grandmother intervening to pressure skeptical parents. She overrides the parents' natural caution, they offer to pay for hormones or surgery, and they actively promote social transition. They act as the ideological enforcer against parental boundaries.
The grandmother's affirmation acts as a social transition accelerator.
That's the term they use. And acceleration is key because the source reminds us of the high historical desistance rate.
Right.
The data shows that historical childhood gender dysphoria had an 80 to 95% desistance rate, meaning the feelings resolve naturally before this affirmation model became dominant. The grandmother, by affirming the identity and promoting irreversible medicalization, locks the identity in.
So she is essentially providing the ideological cover and the financial means for irreversible harms, sterilization, mutilation, and worse, long-term mental health outcomes.
And the source argues that grandmother affirmation is a critical factor in 30 to 50% of these medical transitions. The ultimate consequence is that the generational chain of wisdom, which was designed to protect the lineage, is now actively participating in the medical destruction of that lineage's reproductive capacity and psychological well-being.
This next section represents what is probably the strongest logical pillar of the source material. We're moving from statistical correlation to the natural experiment, looking at communities that just rejected the ideological capture. And if the hypothesis holds, these communities should be thriving on the exact metrics where the mainstream West is collapsing.
And this is where that Bradford Hill criterion of consistency is really satisfied. The source examines three distinct, thriving traditional communities that all share one common denominator: the preservation of the traditional grandmother function.
Let's start with the Amish. They are the ultimate counterfactual, right? They explicitly reject most outside cultural inputs.
Their cultural preservation is deliberate and it's successful. They enforce geographical proximity, which ensures high family involvement. The grandmothers are central, they're teaching traditional skills, and they play a key role in courtship supervision, making sure selection is calibrated toward commitment and stability.
And the outcomes are the complete opposite of mainstream Western trends.
Utterly opposed. The outcomes are staggering. A 6.5 total fertility rate, which is 4 times the replacement rate. Their divorce rate is practically non-existent, less than 1%. And their religious retention rates are over 90%.
So they have a robust, growing, functional society.
Fueled by an intact grandmother function. And you see the same powerful pattern in highly structured communities like Orthodox Jews, particularly the Haredi.
The structure is different, but the function is the same.
Exactly. The bubby, the grandmother, is highly respected, often lives nearby, and her primary role is maintaining the traditional customs, teaching the laws of the kosher household, being deeply involved in matchmaking, explicitly calibrating mate selection for the daughter.
And what are their outcomes?
Similarly, exceptional stability. The Haredi community has a TFR of 6.6. While the broader Orthodox Jewish divorce rate is around 10%, the Haredi rate is significantly lower. Religious retention is robust, between 85 and 90%. Their success is directly tied to honoring and institutionalizing the elder woman's role.
And finally, the source looks at subcultures within the broader Christian community that have tried to reclaim this lost function. They point to traditional Latin Mass Catholics.
And this is maybe the most relevant counterfactual for the broader mainstream, because it represents a deliberate ideological rejection of the 1960s Cultural Revolution. They explicitly adopt the Titus II model, formalizing older women teaching younger women. They reject feminist ideology and prioritize large, stable families.
And their metrics reflect that decision.
Their family structures show fertility rates between 4 and 6 children per family. Divorce rates are typically below 5%. The generational transmission of faith and culture is significantly more robust than in mainstream Catholic or Protestant communities.
So if we synthesize these counterfactuals, the Amish, the Haredi, the traditional Catholics, what is the single key differentiator that prevents collapse?
It is the maintenance of a strong, functional grandmother role, and that's enforced by cultural, theological, and practical necessity. It includes intact intergenerational transmission and, critically, the elder calibration of female mate selection.
They succeeded precisely because they preserved the cultural software that the mainstream Western world just threw away after 1960.
And this is what establishes causation, not just correlation. The pattern repeats consistently. By applying the Bradford Hill criteria, you see the consistency, the specificity, the temporality. The source concludes that this evidence establishes causation with extremely high confidence. The grandmother function is the foundational root mechanism of intergenerational cultural transmission.
We have to conclude this deep dive by addressing the profound implications and the potential remediation strategies the source material offers. And it starts with a pretty chilling theological framing that the authors adopt.
Yeah, the source views this collapse through the lens of spiritual warfare. It argues that the strategy targets the family because the woman is inherently the gateway to the next generation. So by corrupting the elder woman, you corrupt the primary transmission mechanism for faith, virtue, and cultural stability.
And the paper goes even further, interpreting the modern grandmother's affirmation of all this dysfunction as directly related to the judgment that's described in the New Testament, specifically Romans 1.
Right. The authors argue that Romans 1 describes this progressive spiritual judgment where, after humanity suppresses the truth, God ultimately gave them over to a debased mind. And the paper asserts that the final, devastating step of this judgment is giving approval to those who practice evil.
I see. So in this framework, the modern grandmother's willing affirmation of sin, whether it's celebrating divorce, encouraging promiscuity, defending abortion, facilitating gender confusion, that's interpreted by the source as God's judgment manifesting.
Yes, because the traditional moral restraining grace that was held by the elders has been removed. And that places an almost unimaginable weight of responsibility squarely on the shoulders of the ideologically captured grandmothers, the boomers, and Gen X.
The source doesn't pull any punches here.
Not at all. It asserts that they transmitted poison instead of wisdom and irrevocably broke the civilizational chain, contributing directly to those staggering statistics. 63 million abortions, 50% divorce rates, the demographic collapse.
So if that's the diagnosis and the weight of the moral failure, what's the necessary, incredibly difficult first step for recovery, according to the source?
The prerequisite is repentance, or metanoia, a fundamental change of mind. The source demands a radical change of heart, requiring these grandmothers to confess specific generational sins.
Like what, specifically?
It means admitting, I encouraged my daughter to pursue a career over family, or I encouraged my daughter to divorce her husband, or I embraced feminist lies that undermine the domestic role. And critically, they say they must apologize publicly to their families for the harm that was caused.
That requires immense humility, admitting that the ideology that defined your entire adult life was, in fact, poison.
But without that admission, the cultural poison just continues to flow. The next step they outline is the recovery of wisdom, actively seeking out the knowledge that was discarded.
So reading scripture like Titus 2.
Yes, and other traditional texts, and actively relearning the essential domestic skills that were deemed irrelevant, cooking, budgeting, homemaking, to reestablish the functional necessity of their role.
And finally, what are the specific, actionable remediation strategies for individuals and families who are facing this breakdown?
Okay, for the remaining traditional grandmothers, the few that resisted the capture, the source calls them heroes and urges them, do not retire from grandmothering. Their call to action is to pray ceaselessly, teach explicitly, and document their wisdom, recognizing that they are the sole remaining cultural memory.
And for young women, millennials, and Gen Z who may have been lied to by both their mothers and grandmothers, what's the solution the source presents?
It's a direct and challenging one. They are told bluntly, you've been lied to about the nature of family, men, and happiness. The solution is to deliberately circumvent the captured generations.
How do they do that?
Actively seek a traditional grandmother mentor, if possible. Reject the societal mandate for career first. Marry young. They say the early to mid-20s is ideal. choose wisely, prioritizing faith and stable provider traits, and ultimately become the functional traditional grandmother who consciously breaks the cycle of generational failure.
And for communities trying to institutionalize this wisdom,
The paper strongly advocates for implementing Titus II programs, formal mentorship structures, where older women explicitly teach younger women in a structured environment. This means formalizing wisdom transmission in traditional parishes, in homeschooling communities, leveraging the skills of the few remaining traditional grandmothers for formal mentorship roles, making the transmission non-optional.
the evidence across the historical baseline, the statistical collapse, and those flourishing counterfactual communities, it all points to one undeniable conclusion. The grandmother function is the highest leverage intervention point for civilizational health.
Absolutely. The data is consistent. Where that wisdom is preserved, society thrives on every key metric: fertility, stability, faith. Where it's lost, society collapses. The restoration of Western civilization, according to this analysis, is fundamentally tied to whether grandmothers choose wisdom over the ideology they absorbed 60 years ago.
And the source's final exhortation is that clear prescriptive framework set out in Titus 2.35.
That specific instruction is the blueprint for rebuilding what has been shattered. And the consequences of continuing to ignore it are, well, they're visible across every single metric of societal decline we analyze today.
Which leaves us with this provocative thought for you, the learner. If traditional grandmother wisdom preservation is the only consistent factor preventing civilizational decline, as we see demonstrated by those thriving counterfactual communities, what is the single most radical conscious action you could take today to safeguard and institutionalize that traditional knowledge base for your own descendants?